Welcome to Safety Chats. Host Jason Starke, Director of Safety at Baldwin Safety and Compliance, shares decades of aviation experience and a passion for safety. Let's get started with this week's Safety Chat.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Baldwin Safety Chat podcast. Podcast where we talk about everything safety management. We talk about safety. Heck, we even talk about different things. I think I want to start talking a little bit about human performance, but I am coming you to live from Sniffsville. That's what I'm going to call it, Sniffsville, because if you hear me, I'm all clogged up. It's allergies. Some of you may know I was born and raised in Chicago and left Chicago when I was 18, and in the Air Force and being a pilot, I've been to so many places around the world. Also lived in different countries, but my whole life never had allergies. Not once until I landed in Houston. In first year in Houston, I remember thinking I perpetually had a cold. When I went to the doctor, they said, you have allergies. So I don't know what's here in Houston that's not anywhere else in the rest of the world. But whatever it is kicking my backside. But hopefully next time I come to you, I will not have this. Today's topic's a little interesting for a couple reasons. One, a lot of you probably heard of ChatGPT. I have been an ardent non-supporter of ChatGPT. I'd grumpily say, oh, it's just part of dumbing of America. The work that it takes to research and put into papers, I think it's work we should do, and not just put it into ChatGPT and say, spit me out a paper that we know nothing about. It's all AI that spits the stuff out that we don't know. I have been resisting it, but talking to a coworker, she kind of convinced me. She said, okay, well, if you can use it smartly, so if I put in my ideas, resources and quotes I found into ChatGPT, she said if you put that stuff in there, all it does is just organize it and gives you something to work off of, and you can adjust it as needed, and it saves time. For this podcast, I did that. I said, give me a podcast outline. I put in some quotes from Jason Starke from a report from the Dutch Maritime Accident Investigation Board, and a couple other quotes and some thoughts that I had, and it spit me out an outline, which is actually pretty neat. It went along like probably the outline I would have done on myself, which would take me a lot longer. Now, this isn't a podcast about ChatGPT, but if you use it smartly. Do you take control? Because what I fear is that somebody can put in systems theoretical accident management process. I forget what STAMP stands for, but it's this really fancy way of looking at your system and identifying ahead of time where problems could be. It's called STAMP. You can put that in there and then generate a paper, and it'll probably be a lovely paper, but you as the author will have, unless you've done research on it, you as the author will have no idea what it's really talking about. And what I fear is that people are going to start creating these papers with knowledge from ChatGPT that it brings in around the world and putting it out there, and these creators are going to have no idea basically what it's saying. It just sounds good, it looks good, and they put it out there. So my biggest concern about ChatGPT is that, but I think if you use it smartly, it is a good resource to help you save time. So the title of this podcast that ChatGPT gave it was The Consequences of Clumsy Procedures and the Importance of Work as Done Disclosures. I'm like, wow, that's a fancy title. I don't know if I would have thought of that one myself. Probably wouldn't have called it that. But what I really want to talk about here is deviation from procedures. The Safety Committee and the MBAA Safety Committee, we talk about procedural noncompliance. Dave Hunsinger, he talked about, procedural intentional noncompliance, procedural unintentional noncompliance. So he had his pinks and his punks. But that term noncompliance is a little bit sticky. I think what we like to refer to it as is deviation, because noncompliance has a stigma. And that kind of brings me into the first segment of this podcast, is when we deviate from what's considered normative behavior, when we deviate from procedures, there seems to be a moral deviation that's kind of attached to it. Y'all kind of know what I mean, right? When we say you were non-compliant with that procedure, or when the FAA comes down and said you were non-compliant with the SID or the STAR or whatever it may be, you're thinking, wow, I feel like a total heel. I mean, you kind of feel bad because it makes it seem like that these deviations that you have from procedures is like a moral thing, like you're a bad person for deviating from procedures. And that is, unfortunately, the stigma that we have out there. So when we hear a postmortem on an accident, for example, and the first thing that comes up, it says, well, pilot deviated from normal procedures or operator deviated from safety procedures. Right away, we think, bam, they're a horrible person. They ought to fry for that. And a lot of time, and I think Ivan Popolity said it best, is that nobody holds themselves more accountable than the people themselves who have committed the deviation. But the problem is, why do we ascribe blame and moral deficiency to individuals who deviate procedures? And the reason why I asked that question kind of brings me into the second aspect of this. When we have clumsy procedures, when we have ill-defined procedures, when we have procedures that are written by those who are writing from a vision and knowledge in the head versus a vision and knowledge of what's actually going on out there, we're going to have a mismatch. And we're going to have what ChatGPT called clumsy. I thought that was pretty good, but what's called clumsy or ill-defined procedures. The Dutch Maritime Accident Investigation Board, when they created the report on procedures, they said a lot of the procedures are like disassembled goods that you're selling to the public. So it's basically like when you sell the public, when you say, okay, here, you want to buy a desk, and then you just give them the pieces and some of the pieces are missing. Now the public has to assemble it and have frustration assembling it and not even have the final product. That's what they compared procedures to, because when at the front line, when you have procedures, we have to kind of assemble the pieces to fit into the real life scenario that we are encountering. And when the pieces don't fit, then we have to be creative. And we have to, I hate to say deviate at this point, but we have to come up with something to get the mission done, because procedures will not cover 100% of the situation. And when they try to, they become long, unwieldy, almost impossible. How many of you know the fire in the cockpit procedure or fire in the aircraft procedure? Good night. If I'm on fire, the only thing I'm doing is I'm pointing that plane towards another, to an airport, the closest airport, and I'm landing. That checklist, at least in some of the planes I flew, was like 3 pages long. And it's like, no way. And it's trying to cover all these different scenarios, whether it's electrical fire, whether it's a hydraulic fire, whether it's an environmental fire, whatever it might be. It tried to cover all these conditions, but it became very unwieldy. So what we need to look for, especially as safety managers, are these clumsy procedures. And the idea is that if we can find clumsy or ill-defined procedures, then we can cut down on deviation. When we deviate, obviously the other words for that are violations or deviations or non-compliance, but I just like to say we call them deviations because, again, that moral aspect that's ascribed to that word non-compliant. Let's dive a little bit into that, though, because I think this is important, because the procedures themselves, the processes, the policies even, what we see is that they're written, and they're not written with ill intent. They're written with good intent, but they're usually written at a vantage point that isn't right in the front line. It's written by individuals who are removed generally from the front line. They're not in the everyday grind. Like I think of a charter pilot. A charter pilot isn't just flying. The same with 91. You have to manage the passengers. You have to manage the FBO. You got to manage transportation. You got to do all this while also flying the plane. And the procedure makers a lot don't take that into account. And why would they, right? Because they don't know. We need to get to a point, I believe, where we have the procedure makers, the gap between the procedure makers and the procedure followers or the procedure recipients. We need to close that gap quite a bit. The only way we can do that is if we start getting leadership or some of the other individuals that create the procedures to the front line, or we start providing good feedback and we start getting good feedback and we can assess in the organization about these procedures that are not working. What does this look like? It's really interesting. Stephen Schrock, he talks about work as done versus work as prescribed versus work as imagined. So we got these different things. Work as imagined is how people think the work is being done. Work as prescribed is how the work is dictated to be done in the procedures. And then obviously work as done is, well, how the work's getting done. And he talks about how they rarely coincide. So what you have is this idea of a messy reality. And what that messy reality is that you have individuals doing work and they're getting the job done. And by getting the job done, they're being creative, they're being resilient, they're being flexible, but they're not necessarily always following the procedures because the procedures are not working for their environment. But here is the kicker. What Schrock found found is that when outsiders looking into the system, they don't even see this. And to people in the system, to them, it's unremarkable because that's how it's always been done. It becomes almost like tribal knowledge. It becomes tacit knowledge. This is, well, the book says this, but we really got to do it this way. We have to improvise. We have to be creative, I think, is some of the terms that are used. It's very hard from the outside to see when this is being done, especially when we as safety managers, if we're not involved in the procedures, we look into it or we just watch them doing their work. We don't really see that unless we're 100% familiar with the procedures and how it should be done, and then observe every minute of the day how work is being done. That's one of the problems. So people don't see it. Two, rarely, according to Schrock, rarely is work as done disclosed to leadership. And the reason why is because stuff's getting done. And that creates into the third problem is that sometimes, depending on the organization, the leadership will turn their back to it because, well, crap's getting done, so we're just not going to break it or we're not going to fix it if it ain't broke. They're getting stuff done. We don't want to know. That, my friends, is extremely dangerous. In all this, what can we do? What are some things we can do? I don't want to be too utopian in this because, I can sit here and say, well, this is what we can do. This is what you should do. And again, it goes to that disconnect because I'm not on the front line anymore. You all are on the front line. You're running the safety program. You're the ones that have to try to get this information. I can try to encourage a few things. One of them being, ask them. A lot of us who are safety managers, we're pilots. We're very familiar with flight operations, flight procedures and processes and policies. We have a tendency to not want to go get outside help in the flight regime because, well, we're pilots too. We might look weak, but we can get past that because we're very humble. But we need to talk to the other pilots, ask them the question, okay, where in operating in our procedures do you feel that you may have to deviate to get the job done? And I know that seems like an awkward question, but why? Why can't we just ask that question? Again, I know there's that moral stigma with deviating. People think that they're evil if they deviate, but we can say, look, we're trying to find procedures that are more real. And in such, we have to see where you feel you may have to circumvent. I don't know another word. I guess deviate's the word. But where you may have to deviate in order to get the job done. Where do you feel those places are? Could you please let me know? Because then what that will do, that will spark us as an organization to then look at these procedures and say, okay, there's something wrong with them. And also, we can do the same thing with maintenance, and the maintainers, and we need to spend a little more time with maintainers. If you're not already a maintainer, if you're a maintainer as a safety manager, you need to spend a little more time with the pilots and the other functions, and likewise for pilot safety managers. But we need to ask them the question, where do you feel that you have to circumvent procedures to get the job done? I used to fly the Hawker. If you were a Hawker pilot, remember this, the rudder bias TR check. You had to run up each engine separately, and it took some time, and you'd be creating some jet wash behind you, and especially if there's a small plane behind you, or you'd have to go find a spot on the field and park and do it, and that took time and fuel. And so that might be a good candidate and say, well, you know what? We had this passenger, we had a small plane behind us, we felt we had to circumvent that to get the plane off the ground. And we just tell the truth. That allows us then to say, okay, well, maybe we can go back to the manufacturer, maybe you only have to do it X amount of times, or maybe there's another way we can do it, but we don't know what we don't know. And so we need to ask those questions, which kind of the second thing we can do when we see procedural deviations. And usually, unfortunately, this comes along with an event because it's rare unless it's like ASAP, an ASAP program or ASRS or whatever, but where people will admit they deviated if nothing happened, if it was unremarkable. And that's another point I want to get to, but I don't want this to get too super long. If we have these deviations in the organization, we have to resist the urge to ascribe any moral deficiency or any failure or any punishment, because what we might be seeing and be so fortunate to see is a manifestation of poor procedures or something in the system that isn't right. And I know with my time with Isbeo and now here at Baldwin, I've talked about this a lot, but when somebody deviates from a procedure, instead of going right away to saying, well, they just thought they could do it better, they knew better, whatever, we have to slow down and say, okay, why do they feel it important to deviate from that procedure? Maybe there was organizational pressure, maybe the procedure was too complicated, and there was a combination of organizational pressure. There could be a myriad of reasons why a person deviated. So we need to slow down and ask the question why, because that could be a signal. So we talked about talking to the individuals, asking them where they feel they might be deviated. That's a little proactive. A little more reactive is catching the signals in the system or listening for those signals in the system where there are deviations. You can capture those on FOQA. If you have LOSA or line-oriented safety auditing, even engage your part 142. Is that right? 142? There's so many numbers in my head. 142 flight schools, flight safety, SimCom, whatnot. Ask them where they see, not just in your folks, just where do you see a lot of procedural deviation, with a given aircraft. They're a wealth of knowledge and they would be happy to talk to you. They'd love to share that knowledge. At least when I was with flight safety, that was kind of the feeling. Let me go back to that one thought, though, about getting people to report a deviation outside of anything happening. And this was an article, I can't remember who the author was right off the top of my head, but it was a great article. It was especially in NASA, but it was the successful near misses. Basically what the premise is, there is a deviation from safety procedure or deviating around risk controls or whatever it may be, and there's a near miss, but the job gets done. Generally, people see that as a success. They might say, okay, well, why bother doing anything about it? It was successful. So obviously it worked, and they put that back in their back pocket, and chances are they'll do it again. Case in point, I think I might have used this example in the past, but again, going back to the Hawker. With the Hawker, you could not extend the speed brakes with the flaps extended because it could buckle the flaps. Turbulence behind the speed brake. You could not do it. But I flew with a guy who was high up in the company, who was always captain because he was higher ranked than I was. I'm not going to name positions. I doubt he's listening to these anyway. Every time he'd get behind the airplane, especially on challenging approaches, he'd get behind the airplane, going into Santa Barbara, going into wherever, especially Eagle or one of those. He'd get behind the airplane, and what do you know? Next thing, he's got the flaps down, and he's got speed brakes out. I'd remind him. He'd shush me, and he'd continue doing it because we never bent a flap. So in his head, that procedure, he deviated from constantly because in his head, he needed to do something. It worked. The procedure then became to him non-important. Now, that's something that should have been disclosed because we could say, okay, maybe there's something wrong with this procedure, but it never got disclosed. So long story short, we have to be careful of those. So we have to watch where we deviate from procedures. Anyway, that's all I got. I know I've gone on here for about 20 minutes on this. Let me know what you think about this. Let me know if you have any other ideas how we can find these deviations. But importantly, let's reorient our view of deviation to not something so negative. Let's not ascribe a moral deficiency on these people that have deviated. Let's learn from them and let's listen for them. First, let's try to be proactive. Let's talk to them. Let's ask them the question, hey, where do you feel that you have to work around procedures? Secondly, let's ask them the questions then, well, why? Why do you feel you have to do that? And then the more reactive way, say, okay, well, before we start ascribing blame, let's ask the question why. So anyway, let me know what you think. Hey, thanks for stopping by and listening to this. I really super appreciate it. Rate us wherever you listen to this podcast. Give us 4, give us 5, whatever you feel is deserved. Let us know the truth. Drop us a line. Let us know how we can improve. We're here to serve you. So please always feel free to contact me directly if there's anything you want to hear about. But until the next one, stay safe.
This podcast is brought to you by Baldwin Safety and Compliance, the leader in safety management for the transportation industry. Since 2004, Baldwin has been providing state-of-the-art solutions and 24/7 support to the aviation and transportation industries. Baldwin's clients include all sizes and types of transportation operators. Baldwin provides safety and related business services to commercial and non-commercial transportation operators, medical transporters, FBOs, MROs, airports, flight schools, UAS operators, firefighters, OEMs, ground transport operators, and others. Visit BaldwinSMS.com to discover how Baldwin can enhance your organization's safety program.